This is the second video in reviewing quadratic equations and how to solve them. The first video we talked about solving quadratic equations with the square root method. And now we want to look at some other methods. And we're going to go to completing the square, which will involve using the square root method as the last part of it. So the square root method is nice because we can just square root and get our answer. But sometimes we've got a problem. Here we have an x in the mix here. So this x makes things a little complicated. So what we want to do is we want to make this a perfect square trinomial. That's our goal. Remember, for a perfect square trinomial, we have a plus b squared is equal to a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. And so this comes from just multiplying out this binomial. So we get the first thing squared, the second thing squared, that is this b, and the middle must be the product of the two things multiplied. Okay? And so we ask ourselves, what do we need to add to this left side so that this is a perfect square trinomial? Well, it turns out that it's going to be 9. And where that comes from is that's half of this. We ask ourselves, what is half of 6? Half of 6 squared. And that's going to be 9. So we want to add that, but you have to add it to both sides. So we add 9 to this side and add 9 to the right side. And this left side turns out real nice. This can be factored. It's a square trinomial because the square root of this is 1x, the square root of this is 3. And if you take 1x times 3, you get 3x, and double it, you get 6x. And so this factors nicely into x plus 3 squared. And we've got 16 over here. Well, now we got that squared that we were looking for with our square root method. So let's use our square root method. Let's go ahead and square root both sides to get rid of that square. And we get x plus 3. And we get a plus or minus, don't forget that. And we get 4 there. Okay, I'm going to erase this for now. So this is two outcomes. We get x plus 3 equals 4, or x plus 3 equals negative 4. And if we solve both of these, we subtract 3 from both sides, we get 1. And we subtract 3 from both sides, we get negative 7. And there's our solutions. Two solutions in this case. All right. So this completing the square is nice because it always works. Other methods only work part of the time, but this will always work. So here, looks a little more complicated. But the first thing we want to do is get rid of this 5/4. So let's move it on over to the other side. And so we have x squared minus 7x equals negative 5/4. Subtract 5/4 from both sides. And now we've got to ask ourselves, what do we need to complete the square here? Well, let's think about that a little bit. We've got half of 7. We want half of 7 squared. It's always going to be b over 2 squared. And so we got 7 over 2 squared is going to be 49/4. Again, working in fractions is going to be a lot easier here. All right, so let's try adding 49/4 to both sides. So x squared minus 7x plus 49/4 equals negative 5/4 plus 49/4. Now, if we do this right, this will always come out to be the square of a binomial, where our second part of the binomial is just going to be half of this b value here. Half of negative 7 is negative 7/2. Okay, we forgot the negative there, but in the end it didn't come out. It didn't change things. So we got 7/2 squared. This one's going to be negative here because it's negative up here. All right, and so we end up with 44/4 over there. That works out pretty nice. And so now we need to square root that. because we got our squared. That's nice. So we're all ready to square root. And we end up with x minus 7/2 equals, well, this is just the square root of 11, right? 44 divided by 4 is 11. So let's go ahead and write it that way. And it's plus or minus. Okay? And so in the end, we add 7/2 to both sides, and we have plus or minus the square root of 11 plus 7/2. That's a fine answer, but it's important to realize that we have two answers going on here. We got the square root of 11 plus 7/2, or x is negative square root of 11 plus 7/2. And if you plug that into your calculator, you'll get two answers. And again, normally we'll write it this way, but I want you to understand that this really means two answers. Last little example looks a little more complicated. We want to complete the square here. No problem. Let's go ahead and multiply it out. Well, it's a little challenging, but we'll get through it. So let's go ahead and clean it up. And we want to get it in that standard form, which is equal to 0. So we multiply this out, we're going to get x squared. If we multiply plus 1x, and we got minus 3 times x and minus 3 times 1. And then we have this 3x out here. And so that's going to tag along for the ride. 3x. All right. Now let's go ahead and just move everything over. Let's go ahead and, well, let's clean it up first of all. These will cancel out. That's kind of nice. And let's subtract x squared from both sides. Let's go ahead and subtract x from both sides and add 1. All right, so we end up with x squared minus 8x plus 10 equals 0. We might check to see if this is a perfect square, and it's not, because half of this squared is 16. Okay, notice that we have 1 here. That's nice. This has to be 1. If it wasn't 1, we need to divide everything by that term first. If there was a 2 here or 3 here or something like that, divide by that first. But we're all good right now. So let's go ahead and just add that to both sides. Let's subtract 10, that is. X squared minus 8x. Let's just move it over there. If you're clever, you could skip this step, but let's do that just to be safe. And now what do we want to add? Well, we want to add half of this squared. Half of that squared is 16. X squared minus 8x plus 16. And we can do that as long as we add it to both sides. This guy factors into x minus 4 squared. And this simplifies to 6. Then we're going to go ahead and square root. Square root. And we get x minus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of 6, which is 2 point something. And adding 4 to both sides gives us x equals plus or minus square root of 6 plus 4. And there is our solution. Remember, this is two answers. We have positive square root of 6 plus 4, that's one number, and negative square root of 6 plus 4. So there's completing the square. It involves the square root method in the end, but we've got to complete the square first so we can set up this binomial squared. All right, in the next video we'll check out the quadratic formula.